Dune was always going to be hard to adapt to the screen. I mean, it's already had a couple attempts and none were really great. Denis Villeneuve hopes to change that with his version, but even his take isn't a one-to-one adaptation. So let's look at all the differences between the book and the movie, and duh, spoilers, the movie just came out. Okay, we've got a lot to get through, so this part's gonna go by fast. At least I'll try. Here's all the appearance changes. So in the books, both Gurney Halleck and Rabban were both depicted as ugly, and while of course beauty is in the eye of the beholder and all that, but they made really zero attempt to make Josh Brolin an ugly lump of a man, or Dave Bautista look all that different than just an ashier version of himself. Gaius Helen Mohayim, or the lady with the box of pain, is supposed to be this decrepit old lady that is supposed to remind you of a witch, and again, not really what we got, even though they do call her a witch at least once. Then we have the Baron, who isn't nearly as huge or as gross as even other Dune adaptations have made him. Then we have the Mentats, who are never actually called by name, which I learned that Fallout actually stole from Dune, bonus thing. Also just have a tattoo of a black dot on their bottom lip, instead of their lips being red from the sappho juice they drink to make their brains run at 110%. And the Sardaukar have a little more expanded lore added with their blood ritual, which wasn't in the book, making them aesthetically far more violent. And they also have a whole different language, which is similar to how the voice was also changed, since it sounds like someone who is perpetually choking instead of, you know, a regular voice. There's also one more appearance change, but I'll talk about that one a little bit later. Okay, now with all the surface level stuff out of the way, let's talk about Gurney. So in the novel, Gurney is still a pretty intense guy, but he's still got some humor in him. So much so that when him and Paul are sparring, Paul doesn't even realize that Gurney is fighting for real until much later in the fight. Brolin's version is pretty much all business all the time. We do get that one joke about the assassination attempt, but aside from that, all business. Something else that's largely missing is that one of the biggest parts of his characterization is that he also has this love of singing and music in general, along with the thrills of fighting. Now there was supposed to be a scene of him playing the balisette, which is like this lute thing, but Villeneuve ended up cutting it. That's probably because it would have been weird with this characterization, but hopefully in the director's cut that we just have to get for movies these days, we can at least see Brolin shred on that thing. The Baron has also lost pretty much the only redeeming qualities from the novel, and if you've read the novel, you'll know he barely has any to begin with either. He's characterized much closer to that of a monster, and I mean that in like a Scooby-Doo Monster of the Week type of way. In the novel, as long as no one was disrespectful or pushed buttons that you probably shouldn't have, he was honestly, for lack of a better word, polite. Well, I mean, as polite as a sadistic slaver with a penchant for things that I can't say on this platform can get at least. Luckily, that's not really something that they bring up in this version. He's also not the only one from House Harkonnen who's been changed pretty drastically either. Harder to Phrase is more similar to the first film adaptation in the books, and yeah, David Dismalchin really likes to play weirdos, but trust me, that phrase in the novel is way more important to the plot and is way more weird than we get to see in this. Oh, and Fade Rotha just isn't in this at all, which is weird considering his role in the story, but we still have part 2, so maybe he'll make his grand appearance there. Okay, so with the Harkonnens not really doing much or having any character outside of we are the bad guys, let's switch to the House of Atreides. In the book, they actually destroyed Harkonnen space reserves, which made them the first aggressors, and the Duke started something called a Canley, which is like a declaration of war, but where there's no innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Neither of these things happen in the movie, and the Atreides are played completely as the good guys rather than the more morally gray house. For Dr. Yue, they took out the point that he should technically not be able to commit treason, but since that point is a galaxy brain moment in the story that would take a while to explain, I see why it's different. The Atreides' resident Mentat is also different, but mostly in that instead of thinking that Jessica was a potential threat, that whole plotline is gone, and instead of being captured after the attack, he just kind of disappears. We also get scenes of Kaladin, which aren't in the book, like with Paul wanting to go with Duncan on the advance trip, and finally, Jessica is portrayed way more shaken than in the books, because in the books she does the litany against fear, no problem, but in the movie she's breaking down almost every time. Okay, now let's talk about our less than enthusiastic protag, Paul. So for the most part, he actually stays pretty faithful to the source material. He's still struggling with his destiny, he's still not a very outgoing character, and he's still super skinny, which they bring up twice in the movie, so that's nice. But something that was completely left out was his training as a Mentat. Real quick, by the way, a mentat is essentially a person who does the work of a computer, since that wasn't very clear in the movie. Instead, in the movie, they went with its training in the Bene Gesserit arts like the voice, which does make more sense since the whole mentats thing isn't even mentioned by name in the movie. And since the movie kinda skims over what I think are the most important parts of Spice, you know, the whole life extending and mental expansion parts, when he gets checked up on by Dr. Yue, it's treated like the foresight boost that Paul got was just an allergic reaction instead of something that Spice will do to a person. With Paul firmly with the Fremen now, I'm sure they'll explore more of that in part 2. So those little halo-ish overshields that we see throughout the movie are actually not used in the movie correctly, since they explicitly show that things with slow velocities are the only things that are supposed to get through, and then we see the Harkonnens dropping heavy ordnance like it's nothing during the invasion, but that's only an issue in the movie. In the books, they operate the same way, and while the Harkonnens do end up using that same heavy ordnance, it's because of another galaxy brain moment where they think that they won't be using the shields, and they ended up being right. This is one change that I don't really think matters too much, only because seeing the massive shells pierce the shields and go boom made me not really care about the physics and logistics of some space armor. I'm a very simple man, and as long as things go boom, nothing else matters. One character that ended up getting a much larger role in this adaptation is the ecologist Liet Kynes. In the novel, Kynes is a guy, but that change doesn't really matter because the Fremen aren't shown to be as patriarchal as in the book anyway. The two major changes to the character come in how they interact with the Atreides and how they eventually meet their end. So in the book, Kynes is way more standoffish, judgmental, and detached. In the movie, Kynes is also standoffish, judgmental, and detached, but also way more helpful. Her death, though, is completely different and omits something that foreshadows something of a dark revelation in the story, but she gets to go out like a badass by getting eaten by the Arrakis sand bullworm, which is cool. And since we don't get any backstory to her in this movie, she also might not have the same relationship to Chani, but since we only got to see her for a max 10 minutes before the movie ends, maybe that's something we find out in part 2. And finally, let's talk about the Sardaukar really quickly, because their inclusion hits a point that the movie just glossed over. So the three houses, Harkonnen, Atreides, and the Carino, all have different armies. Duh, the first two are named after the houses they reside in, but the Carino have the Sardaukars. Now, in the movie, the fact that the Sardaukars are the Imperial Army is brought up a few times. Like when this guy, whoever he is, says that they are the Emperor's blades, and when Gaius Helen Mohiam tells the Baron that the Emperor is giving him some of his army to help with the invasion. Now, after saying all of that, when the Sardaukar help the invasion, in the books they're all dressed like Harkonnen so that it's not known that the Emperor is picking sides. In the movie, all that is thrown away and they wear their white armor while laying waste to the compound. In both media though, the Sardaukar are found out, but in the novel, it's only because Duncan Idaho notices the specific fighting style that the Sardaukar have. Of course, it makes sense that this wasn't included because your average person isn't going to be able to notice a distinct fighting style when everyone's fighting at night anyway. But it does change the narrative to show that the Emperor doesn't even care if they know he's playing favorites. He's out for blood and he will find it. Or he thought that there would be no survivors. Either one. Dune 2021 is a lot of things, but an entirely faithful adaptation it is not. That's not even a bad thing either. I think it's an interesting version, and looking toward the future, I think it'll be interesting to see how this builds into part 2.